Good evening, dobry večer, guten Abend. Welcome everyone to the 52nd annual Shevchenko lecture, the oldest community public lecture in the Ukrainian community in Canada. Initiated by the Canadian Professional and Business Association of Edmonton more than a half-century ago, it has for some 4 decades of its history been hosted in concert with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and more recently also with the Alberta Foundation for Ukrainian Education Society. Given its long history, it has a unique place in the history of Ukrainian studies in Canada. Over the years, the talk has featured a long line of distinguished and diverse presenters speaking on a wide variety of topics. I would like to acknowledge both the far-sighted vision of the professional and business members, and at the same time to recognize the key role that the Edmonton Association also played in the establishment of Kyiv 42 years ago, the creation of the Foundation of Ukrainian Studies, and the publication of the English Language Encyclopedia of Ukraine. Without the support of the Ukrainian community, both organizations and individuals, CIUS not only would not have come into existence, it would not be able to do the important work that it does in developing Ukrainian scholarship and disseminating the work of specialists on Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora in the academic arena and in the world at large. And I might say that one of the positive signs of change in these last few years has been a large number of specialists in Ukraine who are non-native Ukrainians, non-ethnic Ukrainians. This is a good thing, that the field has broadened and has outgrown or overcome its insular nature that was a characteristic of it earlier. Without the lobbying efforts and the fundraising of the Ukrainian community, there would be no Ukrainian bilingual school program in this province, no history or language courses taught at the University of Alberta, and no cool Ukrainian folklore center or cool folklore chair either. So I want to thank all of you for attending our lecture this evening, and especially to thank members of the Hromada for their stalwart support for Kyiv and for all facets of Ukrainian studies. Finally, I would like to further acknowledge the role played by Dr. Miroslav Shkandry and Orest Tsap, our colleagues at the University of Manitoba, for helping to make possible this appearance of Dr. Umland, who yesterday delivered the 25th annual J.B. Rudnitsky Lecture in Winnipeg. Their initiative is what prompted the Coalition of Centers of Ukrainian Studies at Harvard University and at the Universities of Ottawa and Toronto, as well as the University of Alberta, to get together to share the costs of bringing Dr. Umland to North America from Ukraine. Such collaborative endeavors are not new, but they are increasingly important because of the budgetary challenges that all universities are facing in a rapidly changing environment. I can add from my friend, where are you, Oliver? Aha, Oliver. I can add that it also helps to reduce our carbon footprint by minimizing the travel involved in flying Dr. Umland to so many different and far-flung locations on separate flights, while sparing him the grind of having to go overseas so many times, though we've cheated you out of your frequent flyer points, so there's a downside on this. But I would now like to say a few words about our guest lecturer this evening. The political scientist and historian, Dr. Andreas Umland, was born in the university town of Jena, East Germany, in 1967, a time he undoubtedly doesn't recollect, but I can assure you was a wonderful and interesting year. He obtained his PhD at Cambridge University in 2008, and since 2014 has been a senior research fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation in Kyiv, where he studies contemporary Russian and Ukrainian politics. Dr. Umland has held fellowships and lectureships at Stanford University, Harvard University, University of Oxford, Urals State University, Taras Shevchenko University of Kyiv, the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt, and the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He is an academic advisor to the European Integration Committee of the Parliament of Ukraine, general editor of the book series Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society, and a regular contributor to periodicals such as the Huffington Post Deutschland, Kyiv Post, Newsweek, and Ukraïns'ka pravda. And I'm sure some of you certainly will have read his articles over the years about the situation in Ukraine. Besides producing scores, or certainly dozens of periodical and journal articles over the years, in addition to editing 16 books, he is the author of himself of 14 books, including Russia's Spreading Nationalist Infection, originally published in 2012 by the German Marshall Fund, which you can get for free as a Kindle edition, and Ukraine, What Went Wrong and How to Fix It, issued in April 2015 by Washington's Peterson Institute for International Economics. Dr. Umland has been deeply engaged in Ukraine since 1985 and served as an economic advisor to the Ukrainian government in 1994 to 1997. I hope that Dr. Umland's impressive credentials don't intimidate everyone into silence when the question period comes along, as I'm sure you'll find him an engaging and accessible speaker. The title of his talk this evening is Foreign Invasion, Domestic Decentralization, and European Integration, the Many Challenges of Post-Euromaidan Ukraine. Dr. Umland.
Thank you very much, Jars. Very grateful to be here. Велика честь. Дуже дякую за запрошення. What I want to do is present rather a synthetic paper and not so much an analytic paper, and that I want to bring together a whole number of different issues that, in my opinion, or as I hope, will then illustrate what the whole of the current challenge is that Ukraine is currently facing, and that the peculiarity today of Ukraine is that these issues that are mentioned in the title of the presentation, foreign invasion, European integration, decentralization, and reform in general, are not just linked to each other, as I will illustrate, as all things are somehow linked to each other, but that they are indeed intimately linked with each other, that the foreign invasion has direct repercussions for Ukraine's European integration and is very directly linked also, of course, to the domestic reform process. So I want to speak here about three topics. The first one is a more general one. I will talk about what is also in the abstract for the presentation mentioned, the so-called simultaneity problem of transforming states. That sounds a little bit cryptic, simultaneity problem, but is something very similar, very simple. I will explain what is meant by that. Then I want to talk about a paradoxical situation in post-Soviet Ukraine that has the simultaneity problem, namely simultaneous challenges, foreign invasion, European integration, domestic reform. But unlike in other situations, both historic other situations, but also in other situations in the post-Soviet sphere currently, in a rather peculiar and paradoxical and rather intriguing way, the simultaneity problem becomes also, or the simultaneity issue is not only a problem, but becomes also something that actually drives reforms and that makes Ukraine in a very paradoxical way more stable than one would, and more reformist than one would expect from the traditional view on this simultaneity problem. And finally, the third part will be policy prescriptions, what the West should do, what Ukraine should do, what East European member states of NATO and the European Union could do to help Ukraine in overcoming these grave challenges that Ukraine is currently facing. But first, about the conceptual issue, this peculiar situation of a simultaneity of similar and dissimilar, parallel and partly contradictory, partly mutually enforcing transformation processes. So when we look at why democratizations and transitions to democracies have failed in the past, then often what is an explanation for these failures of democratization and collapses of democracies is an accumulation of problems. And it's not just that they accumulate and that they sort of become too much for a political system to bear, but that they also reinforce each other. And that the simultaneity of these challenges of transformation, reformation, foreign, domestic challenges, that these are then too difficult for a democratic liberal order to handle. And the classical case for that is, of course, Weimar Germany. And Weimar Germany, just to remind you, was actually a country that, if you look very schematically on it, should have been a successful democracy. It had by that time, relatively developed industry, science, a higher education system, a rather sophisticated party system, a well-organized working class and trade unions, a well-developed civil society, which has been even called Verbandsmeierei, pathological associationism, not just lots of associations, but too many associations in a way, a well-established rule of law, an effective public administration system, a sophisticated urban middle class, and no foreign troops on German soil. A reduced territory, of course, after World War I, but it was not, as other countries actually occupied during World War I. But nevertheless, this democracy failed rather spectacularly, and I think that the explanation for that is exactly the simultaneity problem, that Germany had not just to democratize after the so-called Second Empire collapsed in 1918, it had to the Germans had to redefine their nation in a post-imperial way. They had to form their identity, and they had to go in parallel to their democratization through processes of a post-traditional cultural liberalization, secularization, emancipation, pluralization, internationalization, and globalization. And the accumulation of these challenges after the introduction of democracy after World War I was then too much, and it was then, of course, accelerated by the Great Depression in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And something similar can be observed as well on a structural abstract basis for the post-Soviet proto-democracies of the early 1990s, including Ukraine. These were also relatively modern countries, highly educated, most of them relatively egalitarian as well initially. These were societies without larger fundamentalist tendencies, religious tendencies. These were already largely non-traditionalist societies, and one could even argue that the Soviet legacy was not only negative. It had managed to implement large infrastructure development projects. It had secured a certain technological progress, for instance, in space exploration. It had organized large-scale natural resources extraction. It had certain achievements in educational affairs, especially in terms of literacy or training in mathematics, technical issues and languages, in industrial development and engineering, in agriculture, and especially, of course, in military matters, in the designing, production, and export of weapons, and organization of more or less modern armies. So these countries that came out of the Soviet bloc were in many ways quite modern, actually. But they also faced, like on an abstract level, like post-World War I Germany, the simultaneity problem, that when they became independent and became proto-democracies, and most of them had attempts of democratization, at least the formal institutions indicated that, They had simultaneously to form their identities as independent nations. They had to build states from scratch partly. They had to decolonize. They had to economically liberalize, to privatize. They had to create new public administration systems and to form civil societies. And for a whole number of these countries, these challenges proved to be too much, and they became again authoritarian or even totalitarian states like Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan, which had admittedly very short periods of democratization, but still there was this moment in all of these post-Soviet republics. Moreover, these post-Soviet states were faced with a particular challenge that has been recently, I think, very well conceptualized by an American scholar at George Washington University, Henry Hale, in a book called Patronal Politics. And with patronal politics is here a peculiar post-Soviet phenomenon described, is that we had, in fact, in most of these post-Soviet, and still have in most of these post-Soviet states, hidden political systems that exist behind the official institutions, and the official institutions often look rather Western. Parliaments, governments, even parties, presidencies, and so on. And behind these official institutions, and also elections, or pseudo-elections at least, we have political systems that are characterized by informal exchange networks, by patron-client relationships, by pyramid structures with a major patron on the top. Often that is the president also of that country, of a complicated relationship between the official institutions like the president and the unofficial patron-client relationships. And the interesting thing about these patronage systems, about this patronal politics, is that these hidden political systems, that they exist in different official political systems. So we have these patron-client relationships and pyramidic structures of patrons, sub-patrons, and their clients in democracies, for instance, in Ukraine under Yushchenko, in hybrid regimes, for instance, in Ukraine under Yanukovych, in authoritarian regimes, like, for instance, Russia under Putin, or in totalitarian regimes like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And so these patronalistic systems, they have quite different ideological covers, and they are even able to survive they have been even able to survive the so-called color revolutions. And the question then arises: why did some of these countries overcome the simultaneity problem? Why did they manage to get out of these patronalistic mechanisms and become eventually more or less functioning liberal democratic states, although we have now with countries like Hungary and Poland, regressive tendencies. And the explanations here are, I think, quite obvious. Some of the countries that were so successful, or most of them, had historical experiences of having been already democracies, or at least states, independent states. They benefited after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc from large Western developmental aid programs. And what was perhaps most important for them is that they were provided early on, or relatively early on, with a credible EU membership perspective. And this EU membership perspective and the conditionality mechanism attached to this membership perspective was quite an important factor in focusing the elites of these countries on reforms and leading them to conduct eventually successful economic and political reforms. And what also, of course, played for many of them an important role is that they also got a NATO membership perspective, and that they became NATO members and thereby were provided with a degree of security that certainly also furthered their successful economic and political development. And even so, one has to say that as now the examples, especially of Hungary and Poland, illustrate, these are still democracies with certain deficits. Ukraine had, even until 2014, before the start of the war with Russia, an especially grave simultaneity problem. It had to, already before, national security was for Ukraine more important than for other countries. It had to complete especially far-reaching domestic reforms, because Ukraine was very closely integrated in the Soviet economy. It had to conduct a Europeanization without a EU membership perspective, and it had to consolidate and secure a post-colonial state with very little history of previous state building. And the simultaneity problem that was already quite grave for Ukraine before the war then becomes especially grave after the start of the war. Because now we have even more challenges that are added to the already grave problems that Ukraine is facing in building its post-Soviet nation and state. So the war itself is very costly, thousands of dead, tens of thousands of wounded and traumatized, enormous medical material costs, destruction of infrastructure, but also a lot of war-related strain. About 7% of the territory lost through the annexation and the occupation of the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of the eastern part of the Ukrainian Donbass. Around 15% of the industrial capacity lost. What is, I think, often in the West underappreciated is the enormous distraction of civil society that had been mobilized during the Euromaidan by the war, because the civil society immediately after the Euromaidan, or the larger part of it, redirected its attention to supporting the defense of the fatherland and supporting the troops. Foreign direct investment has been scared away from especially eastern and southern Ukraine. There is often here, I think, a misperception in the West that Ukraine's main problem with foreign direct investment is corruption and the lack of rule of law, which are certainly issues that hinder foreign direct investment, and that the investors that are already in Ukraine mostly name as the primary sources for their problems. But the paradox here is, of course, that before the war, under Yanukovych, foreign direct investment was much higher, that foreign direct investment during the war has been higher in western Ukraine than in eastern and southern Ukraine, and that in other very corrupt countries there's much higher foreign direct investment, post-Soviet countries, than in Ukraine. And all that seems to me to indicate that, after all, the war and the security issue has a very direct relation to foreign direct investment, and may be influencing this issue, in this particularly challenging issue for Ukraine today more than is often assumed in the West. And of course, the large challenges that Ukraine is facing since 2014 through internal displacement of persons and through outmigration from Ukraine. But I think you know probably these issues, so I won't go into the detail. And that one could also speculate that the fact that Ukraine still has no membership perspective, only an association agreement, but not an affiliated membership perspective is maybe also connected to the war. Perhaps a country that would not be at war with Russia would have already received already from the EU more clearer signals that it has a future chance to accede to the European Union. Still, I would say that, or because of these enormous challenges, I would say that the actual thing that needs to be explained, if you summarize all of these challenges, and perhaps I have forgotten here some additional problems and challenges, what needs to be explained is actually that not why reforms in Ukraine have been slow and progress has been slow, but instead why in Ukraine, under these enormously challenging conditions, a pluralistic regime has been preserved until now. Reforms have made considerable progress, not as much as I, for instance, hoped in 2014, but in a number of spheres, the reform progress is quite visible. That the state has indeed survived under conditions of hybrid war and outside an international security alliance, and that the state has even consolidated in a number of spheres during the last 4 years, especially, for instance, in the military sphere. And what I'm observing here, and these are so far more hints than results of systematic empirical research, is that in a very peculiar way, the accumulation of challenges that Ukraine is today facing, to a certain degree, and I will explain how, neutralizes the simultaneity problem. So there seems to be a certain point at which the simultaneity problem becomes actually sort of less grave, because the number of challenges then changes the quality of the situation. Or even more paradoxical, the simultaneity of challenges that Ukraine is currently facing in foreign affairs, in domestic affairs, in its European integration, may even have a reform accelerating effect. Not just that the reform hindering effect of the simultaneity problem is not as grave as one would expect from the large number of various challenges, but that even in a certain paradoxical way, the reforms are, by the multitude of challenges, accelerated. So one of the paradoxes, for instance, one of the explanations for this situation is that the Orange Revolution, and especially the aftermath of the Orange Revolution, has certainly been for Ukraine a very negative experience. It was a history of failure from 2005 till 2010, and then with the disaster, I would say, of the election of Viktor Yanukovych. But on the other hand, this very failure, of the Orange Revolution, the Orange Revolution wasn't in all regards a failure, but at least it did not then lead to a political development that clearly the revolution implied. This very failure today has created a positive situation in the way that the civil society has learned from this failure. And after the Euromaidan, civil society did not demobilize like after the Orange Revolution, but remained mobilized and has in fact put quite an effort into creating a sustainable long-term alliance of reform-pushing civil society organizations that would, independently from whom is in power, which coalition is ruling Ukraine, which parties in parliament are present, would be pushing for reforms. And you perhaps now know that this association is called the reanimation package of reforms, which unites over 70 civil society organizations that are constantly engaged in the formulation and implementation of reforms. So in a way, this negative development after the Orange Revolution has led to a historical learning process and has today positive after effects. And I think that is one of the explanations that we, under these challenging conditions, have a relatively stable Ukrainian state and considerable progress in terms of reform. Another very peculiar effect of the last 4 years has been that the enormous stress that the Ukrainian state has been during the last 4 years, especially as a result of the war, has on the other hand also created enormous opportunities for leverage for international donors, Western donors, and developmental organizations. The International Monetary Fund and the European Union have been, because Ukraine is in such a grave situation, been able, more than after the Orange Revolution, have been better able to apply conditions to the disbursement of their help. And this has then, in combination with the mobilized situation, led to what has been called recently the sandwich model of reforms, namely that these international donor organizations, above all the Monetary Fund and the European Union, they closely cooperate with the civil society, and independently of the developments in the narrowly defined political sphere, they are jointly pressing for reforms in parliament, in government, in the presidential office. And this leverage is created in a very paradoxical way, also by the war, and is an after effect of the simultaneity of challenges that Ukraine is facing and the enormous stress that the government and the entire state is currently experiencing. So I think that is another explanation for this relative stability and progress in Ukraine during the last 4 years. A third factor, I think, that has also and that may also in the future be a factor that will be supportive for Ukraine is that the aggressiveness of Russia towards the West, not only towards Ukraine, but also towards the European Union, and especially towards the United States, is now sort of having after effects that are also, I would say, in a paradoxical way, beneficial to Ukraine. So what we are now currently observing in the United States, that Russia and Eastern Europe is, because of the Russian meddling in US domestic affairs, again a major topic in American public debate. And it's not only that that Russia is also perceived not only by Ukraine but also by the US as an enemy again, but I would say on an even more basic level, what is beneficial here to Ukraine is maybe not so much this this community of interpretation, but the simple fact that the US political establishment, the experts, the diplomats, the politicians, they are today talking about Russia and Eastern Europe and not about China, or not so much about China or about Latin America or India or the European Union. And that Russia, unlike in the 1990s and Eastern Europe and Ukraine as well, are receiving a rather large amount of attention, and I think that is good for Ukraine. It's one of the explanations that Ukraine is now getting more support from the United States. So on the one hand, of course, the aggressiveness of Russia is an enormous problem for Ukraine. But on the other hand, the escalating Russian war against the democratic progress worldwide is also creating then beneficial, in certain parts at least, beneficial situation for Ukraine. A fourth factor that I will, fourth paradox that I want to mention here is that in a very strange way, decentralization that is currently happening in Ukraine has been a reform that has been supporting state stability and supporting the survival of the Ukrainian state under conditions of a hybrid war. So a normal situation, in a war situation, in a war, or a normal development in a war situation for a country would be to re-centralize finances, public administration, leverages of power, and to have decisions made in a war situation in the capital and not in the regions. But what Ukraine is facing here is not a classical war, it's a hybrid war that is conducted with military means, but also with a multitude of non-military means. And for instance, and decentralization becomes actually, in a very paradoxical way here, an instrument to neutralize partly this hybrid war. So for instance, decentralization, as maybe you have read or heard already a little bit about it in Ukraine, is not federalization, it's not regionalization of Ukraine, but it is a devolution of power down to the local level, to communities, villages, to cities, to amalgamated territory, communities, amalgamated local territories. And this non-federal decentralization neutralizes the Russian hybrid tactic of trying to bring about a federalization of Ukraine that would then be an instrument for Russian hybrid war to get more territories of Ukraine under its control, and the prototypical exploitation of this of previously regionalized Ukraine was, of course, the annexation of Crimea. That the autonomous status of Crimea and the quasi-federal status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea was conducive and was providing Russia with the context, with the political context that made the annexation of Crimea easier for Russia. And in a very paradoxical way, the fragmentation that Ukraine is currently experiencing through decentralization is supporting the unity of the state. So, for instance, the Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, the Supreme Council, Ukraine's national parliament, Andriy Parubiy, argued during the second All-Ukrainian Forum of Amalgamated Communities at Kyiv in December 2017, quote, "The path of decentralization was an asymmetrical response to the aggressor, i.e. to Russia. In fact, the process of capable hromadas formation through the amalgamation of the former smaller communities was a kind of sewing together of the Ukrainian space," unquote. So the idea here is simply that that the devolution of power down to the local level has deprived Russia of one of its major instruments to split Ukraine. And now to the final part, the policy prescriptions. So what I've just outlined was basically a synthetic, or my synthetic, I would say, view on how Ukraine and why Ukraine has rather paradoxically survived this period of enormous challenges, domestic and foreign challenges, and how Ukraine under these conditions has, unlike many other countries that were also in transformation in recent history, in 20th century, in 21st century history, has remained a pluralistic state and a democratic country. And I would not say that this is not only a sort of pluralism by default, as some scholars like Lucan Vey have argued. I think that there's more to it. It's not just that Ukraine is pluralistic because the structure of society is so, and therefore there's no other way than to have a pluralistic political system. But there is also a democratic spirit and a democratic general structure of public discourse that has, so far at least, survived these enormous challenges. Nevertheless, I think for the future of Ukraine and for the survival of the Ukrainian state and for the success of its reforms, there will be necessary a whole array of policies, of older policies, of new policies that will need to be implemented in order to consolidate the post-Soviet Ukrainian state. So what is currently done are the sort of programs, and the West does already a lot, that are traditional and that are geopolitically and also for the domestic affairs of the supporting states in Western Europe and North America not particularly challenging. They might be financially already quite significant, but they do not imply major new policy instruments, the development of major new policy instruments and geopolitical steps that would entail larger risks also for the supporting countries. So what we have is standby agreements with the Monetary Fund, lots of project support by the European Union. We have lots of support for civil society, student exchange, civic education programs, a lot of scientific cooperation, infrastructure development, support of small and medium enterprises, help in the containment of HIV, or help in with regard to the Chernobyl reactor. But what I think is necessary both for Ukraine and for the European Union and also for the US is to think about new instruments that are politically and psychologically arguably more difficult to employ because they tackle uncharted territories, they touch toxic topics, like for instance historical memory. They imply the use of unusual instruments that have not yet been used for the post-Soviet sphere, or they demand the development of entirely new instruments and institutions. So what we have already is, I would say, two instruments that are currently actively discussed and partly already being implemented that I would classify as sort of being hybrids between established traditional Western instruments of help and novel instruments of help for democratizing post-Soviet countries. And by that I mean here the now forthcoming delivery of lethal weapons by the US to Ukraine. And particularly interesting issue is going to be the discussion and the decisions that will be made on the UN peacekeeping mission project that has recently entered discussion, and that is a very new discussion that was 2 years ago already proposed by Ukraine, but was rejected as an idea by most Western politicians. There's no solution to you may have heard about this idea that for the Donbass, a solution could be that there would be a large peacekeeping operation of the UN modeled on earlier such missions in, for instance, Yugoslavia. That is a proposal that Poroshenko has already made in 2015. And interestingly, in 2017, Putin has mentioned the UN in the context of the Donbass. He has mentioned it not in the same way and with the same intention, obviously, as Poroshenko and Ukraine, but he has at least mentioned the topic, and that's why now the topic has been taken up by both the United States and the European Union as something to be developed. So this is certainly, I think, an instrument that goes already beyond traditional instruments of helping Ukraine, and that has perhaps a chance of being implemented if and when the Kremlin decides that it wants to get rid, at least, of some of the sanctions that the European Union especially has introduced in connections to the Donbass, and that maybe the Kremlin at some point will decide that the socioeconomic issues are so important for the survival of the Putin system that it will look for a face-saving method to get out of the Donbass, thereby to get rid of the sanctions and to thereby then strengthen again the Russian economy. However, one should not misunderstand also or overestimate, I think, the significance of the UN peacekeeping idea, because this is certainly an idea that would help Ukraine a lot. It would make Ukraine more secure. It would provide stability, but it would be for a limited amount of time, this operation in the Donbass. It would be for a limited territory, and it would not, in principle, solve Ukraine's gray zone problem, namely that it is, like Moldova and Georgia, in a geographic area in Europe that is not covered by a major security organization, and that is between the Russian-dominated bloc of the Organization of the Collective Security Treaty, or also called Tashkent Pact, and the Eurasian Economic Union on the one side, and on the other side the EU and NATO. So this peacekeeping operation of the UN that hopefully will happen in the Donbass would certainly be very helpful to Ukraine, but it will not be a full solution of the security issue. So what therefore I think is also necessary is that other instruments, other new instruments need to be talked about, and they concern European integration, the general security situation of Ukraine going beyond the Donbass, and what will be for Ukrainian politicians a particularly challenging topic is how then to implement the Minsk agreement if indeed the peacekeeping operations, how to implement the Minsk agreements if the peacekeeping operation happens. And now more on these three issues. So the oldest, I think, issue with regard to European integration that will have to be, I think, resolved at some point is that Ukraine and also Moldova and Georgia, they need a membership perspective. This is an old argument. You may have heard already about this, that countries that transform themselves, post-totalitarian countries, need a target, so to say, for the elites to work upon. They need a focal point around which civil society, economic elites, political elites can rally, and that will be also an instrument then for the European Union to push through the necessary reforms for starting membership negotiations and eventually entering the European Union. What can be done here to also further this process is, and that will be a challenging issue, I think, for Ukraine, that Ukraine should, I think, somewhat refocus its European attention away from Brussels and from Berlin, and also maybe not look as much as it did until recently on countries like Poland and Slovakia and the way they reformed and became EU and NATO members, but that maybe for Ukraine the way to go is to follow the current path of the Western Balkan countries. And I think that is, in a way, a more for Ukraine, a more important issue, because these countries, some of them have already entered the European Union or NATO, or the European Union and NATO. Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro has become a NATO member. Some of them are now sort of scheduled to enter the European Union. Serbia and Montenegro may be the next countries that will enter the European Union. And others are still on their path towards membership in these organizations, and their future is sort of open. And thereby, I think these countries are now actually in a situation that is more similar to Ukraine, and Ukraine would be, I think, wise to enter the various structures that the European Union has created for preparing the Western Balkan countries for membership negotiations and finally accession to the European Union. You may have seen an article I've published with an Austrian colleague where we detail this particular strategy. So what we advise there is that the European Union has created in the Western Balkans 16 structures, 16 institutions that are designed for particular policy spheres: finance, education, healthcare, public administration, and that are especially designed to bring together various parts of the elites of the Western Balkan countries with experts and from the European Union, and to prepare then the elites of the Western Balkan countries for and to support them in the Europeanization process. And Europeanization is here I should perhaps say this, is in political science a technical term that does not mean that the culture of a country should become European, but Europeanization means simply the introduction of the rules and the laws of the European Union, the so-called acquis communautaire. So Europeanization refers here not to culture or mentality or something like that, but to the particular legislation of the European Union. The third instrument that could further European integration of Ukraine and perhaps also of Moldova and Georgia would be a new initiative that has recently emerged in Eastern Europe, the so-called 3 Cs initiative. You may have heard about it. Last year, Donald Trump attended a summit of the 3 Cs initiative in Warsaw. And this initiative, developed above all by Poland, is a project so far of EU member countries that aims to connect the East European member countries of the European Union stronger and more tightly than they were before. It's mainly about infrastructure, transportation, energy, communication. And so far, unfortunately, I would say this initiative is limited only to EU member countries. And I think one of the instruments to bring Ukraine closer into the sort of realm of the European Union would be to add it to this initiative. So far, this hasn't happened, but I think there's a chance to do that, and that is something to explore both for Ukraine. I think in Ukraine there is already a readiness and a will for participating in this 3 Cs initiative, but I think that there needs to be some work done both in the European Union, that the European Union would agree to an extension of the 3 Cs initiative to Eastern Partnership countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And perhaps there might be also some support from the US necessary for this. So these would be three ways to go that I think that could help Ukraine in its European integration, and with a membership perspective, the EU would have to to change former policies. With regard to use of the Western Balkan integration schemes, I think the Ukrainian elite would have to rethink its foreign policy preferences. So far, I don't see that happening, frankly. I think the foci in Kyiv are on Washington, on Brussels, on Berlin, and the path that Ukraine wants to go is that of Poland or of Slovakia or the Czech Republic, but not that of the Western Balkan countries. And for the 3 Cs initiative, the East European countries that are currently forming the 10 countries that are currently in this initiative, they would have to redefine this initiative in order to include the associated 3 associated countries of the EU's Eastern Partnership Program. With relation to security issues, I think there are also some new instruments necessary to make the Ukrainian reforms and the sustainable and to improve the stability and security of the Ukrainian state. On the side of the US, I think there has to be, one has to restart a discourse, a debate about whether Ukraine should become a member of the so-called major non-NATO ally scheme of the US. This is a particular program that the US has with regard to close allies of the US that are not NATO member countries. The prototype for this year is the security treaty between South Korea and the US from 1953. This was already discussed with regard to Ukraine in 2014 in the Ukraine Freedom Support Act. In the draft for this law, provision of the major non-NATO ally status was already included, but shortly before the law was adopted in December 2014, the phrase about the major non-NATO ally status was excluded again. So this would be something that Washington would have to consider. And as I mentioned, maybe the current escalation of tensions between Russia and the US could be helpful in that regard. Another project and initiative that could help here Ukraine is an informal gathering that I think outside Eastern Europe is not very well known. It's a group of 9 East European NATO member countries. This group is called Bucharest 9. And these are countries in Eastern Europe that are all NATO members and that gather regularly now and that consult with each other about the peculiar security and stability challenges that the East European countries, member countries of NATO face with regard to Russia above all. Again, like with the 3 Cs initiative, this is currently a group, an informal group within NATO. It's something that is also defined in relation to NATO as something that is not in contradiction to NATO, but that is supposed to strengthen NATO. But I think because this structure is informal and it does not have any direct implications for the other member countries of NATO, it might be also in the future an instrument with which Ukraine could be integrated in the Euro-Atlantic community. So that would be something for Ukraine, but also for the East European member countries, like in the case of the 3 Cs initiative, to consider. Another security-related issue here is very different, has another dimension, and that is the already mentioned challenge of how to bring foreign direct investment to eastern and southern Ukraine. As I mentioned, Western Ukraine does not have such a grave problem with foreign direct investment. There is some new foreign direct investment after 2014 in Western and Central Ukraine. Also, as I mentioned already, there was much more foreign direct investment in the whole of Ukraine before 2014, and there's lots of foreign direct investment, for instance, in Russia, although it is obviously also a state with a weak rule of law and a lot of corruption. And the question is going to be how one can provide support for the development of the depressed East Ukrainian and Southern Ukrainian regions under conditions of Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine that, of course, concerns above all the Russophone or largely Russophone regions of Ukraine. And the obvious instrument here is to provide an insurance, preferably an insurance without costs for an investor that would insure such foreign direct investments against political risks, the risks that could emerge through occupation, through war, through disturbances. That is an old idea as well. To my knowledge, George Soros has first wrote about this in, if I remember that rightly, in March 2014 in The Guardian, where he mentioned this issue that foreign direct investors will be reluctant to go into territories that are in sort of particularly volatile, geopolitically volatile regions. And this is something that would be something that would be very important, that investors still come in these regions. Not only would more foreign direct investment and also domestic investment from Ukrainian investors have obviously positive effects on economic and social developments in eastern and southern Ukraine, but there will be also indirect effects of especially foreign direct investments, in that if you have more investors there, more international companies present in these regions, then this also increases the stakes of military escalation and of hybrid war in these regions. And the final and maybe in a way most difficult for Ukraine, most difficult issue is what to do with the Minsk agreements when the moment comes to implement the political parts of the Minsk agreement. So far, this is an issue that can be postponed and that has been postponed by, as far as I at least observe, by the Ukrainian political elite. I don't know of a public discussion of what to do actually with the political part. What I see instead is on many parts of Ukrainian society, both political society but also civil society, is a rejection of the political part of the Minsk agreements, especially of a special status for the currently occupied territories. And the problem here is how to make, especially this special status, domestically acceptable if the security parts of the Minsk agreements, and you may know that the Minsk agreements have sort of two parts. One of them is related to the war itself, ceasefire, exchange of prisoners, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and if the UN peacekeeping mission happens, a demilitarization of the de-weaponization of the currently occupied territories. And then, if that happens, then will come a moment when not only Russia but also Ukraine's Western partners will say, now it's time to implement the political parts. And I think what Ukraine will have to do is to think, not to reject, as is currently done, simply the political part, but to think creatively about how to, as as a proverb says, how to keep so to say, how to make it domestically acceptable and to satisfy the international community. The road to do that, I think, is again through decentralization. I think that is here again an instrument that Ukraine can apply. It can apply the instrument of amalgamation of communities in these currently occupied territories, thereby restructuring the political sphere there. And it can, in particular, employ the currently envisaged parallel structure that is foreseen in the decentralization process, namely the introduction of prefects in Ukraine as a control mechanism in a decentralized Ukrainian state. You may have seen this project in the new constitution for Ukraine, in which a new institution would be introduced, somewhat following the French example of prefects, of representatives of the president in the regions. And I think what Ukraine could simply do here is that it would not reject the political parts of the Minsk agreements, but would implement it. But what Ukraine could do is to introduce a parallel power structure in the currently occupied territories that would be, so to say, the last instance of power in these regions. That is certainly something that Moscow would dislike. That is also something one could argue that would in a way be in contradiction to the current spirit of these agreements, because if you now read these agreements, they actually imply that these regions that are currently occupied would have a degree of autonomy that would be different from the rest of Ukraine, and that they would de facto remain under indirect control of Moscow. And the creativity, I think, that is demanded here of Ukraine is to trick, in a way, when the moment comes, Russia, and to introduce here a parallel structure that would not, in the latter, contradict the Minsk agreements. It would perhaps contradict the Russian interpretation of the Minsk agreements, but that would be then internationally also accepted. So what is necessary here is that on the one side, Ukraine would have to develop a plan how to basically neutralize the current diminution of its sovereignty in the currently occupied territories that is foreseen once these territories return under Kyiv control, or are supposed to return under Kyiv control. And then so to say, to sell this plan to the West, because the problem of the Minsk agreements is not so much that Russia would be unhappy if the special status is not really implemented as Russia imagines that to be, but the problem is here that the West has been also part of the negotiations of the Minsk agreements, and in particular Germany and France have been part of the Normandy format and of the preparation and signing of these agreements, and that Ukraine would have to come with a proposal to the West where it would formally fulfill the political parts of the Minsk agreements, but on the other hand, through decentralization and through such instruments as amalgamation of territories and through the introduction of a parallel power structure involving prefects and maybe special National Guard units in the occupied territories, that would then, in fact, leave these territories under the full control of Kyiv, in spite of the implementation of the political parts of the Minsk agreements. So this is my perhaps somewhat confusing presentation. I've tried to synthesize here a lot of very different issues, and I've tried to illustrate how these different foreign and domestic issues are closely linked to each other. Perhaps some of the issues have, because of this of the synthetic and reduced character of this presentation, perhaps remained unclear. And I'm happy then to clarify them in the questions and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Umland, for a very thought-provoking talk. As one of the people, and I'm sure there's a bunch of us in this room, who follows Ukrainian affairs on a daily basis, sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees. And so I find it very useful to see you step back and to look at things in the big picture and to see these processes, these issues, these challenges, these overlaps that take place, and to try to make sense of what the reality is, because of course there's the perception that, you know, you hear often, oh, Ukraine is failing at reforms. Well, it isn't failing at reforms. It could do better at reforms, whatever. That there are very, very many different nuanced interpretations to this, and I think that you've presented a kind of panoply of them. You ended with the Minsk Accords, but I want to bring it a little more closer to the current situation. Would you comment about how European communities in the last while, particularly Germany, and their relationship with Ukraine, where one of the concerns, of course, I think Ukrainians have is watching what's going on in France, what's going on in Slovakia, what's going on in Prague, in the Czech Republic, in Poland, in Hungary in particular. Things seem to be going backwards in some places, but especially Germany. You know Germany well. Germany is also in a very difficult situation. If Merkel has finally formed a coalition government, what do you predict is going to happen with German-Ukrainian relations in the coming months, year?
Well, that's since last week, that is relatively easy to say. At least I think for the next couple of years, it will largely remain as it is currently, because we have we have not yet a new government, but we have already a coalition, a ratified coalition agreement between the three coalition partners: the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and the Bavarian Christian Social Union. And that is the same coalition that we had before. What is still unclear is who will be the new foreign minister, but it will be most probably a politician from the Social Democratic, as was the case before with Sigmar Gabriel and Frank-Walter Steinmeier. So I think the prediction here is, at least for the next couple of years, an easy one. What will happen then is difficult to say. I think at some point Angela Merkel will leave, will have to leave. There's a lot of discussion already within her party about replacing her. So far, there's no obvious successor to her. And of course, there's the currently relatively hawkish position of Germany, at least within the context of the European Union, with regard to Ukraine, in terms of defending Ukrainian interests, and with regard to Russia in terms of upholding the sanctions regime against Russia, is linked to Angela Merkel to a certain extent. Nevertheless, and that is a very difficult, of course, or maybe a speculation that I should not make, I would think that on the whole, I think the position will remain the same, because we do have a pro-Russian challenger now in the Bundestag, the right-wing populist party Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, which is quite explicitly pro-Russian and which has justified explicitly the annexation of Crimea. But unlike, for instance, in Austria, this right-wing populist party, in Austria we have now a governing party, the right-wing populist party, the so-called Freedom Party of Austria, which is also very pro-Russian. Unlike in Austria, I cannot imagine that the alternative for Germany will become as strong as the Freedom Party in Austria, and I cannot imagine that the Freedom Party, the alternative for Germany, will enter like the Austrian Freedom Party, the German government. So far, at least, all of the parties in all of the other parties in the German parliament have quite explicitly said that they will not go into a coalition with the alternative for Germany. And so far, at least, this very pro-Russian party remains isolated. The other parties are relatively close in their positions towards Russia. The Social Democrats are somewhat less hawkish. The Left Party has pro-Russian tendencies as well, but in the last couple of years, I would say, even the Left Party has become more cautious in its pro-Russian pronouncements, because the Russian regime has become sort of radical right-wing, one could say, and it sort of creates tension, and also because the alternative for Germany, which is right-wing, supports Russia so far. So, and even if one counts the Left Party together with the right-wing populist alternative for Germany as pro-Russian, there is still about 75% of the electorate of Germany votes for parties that have relatively similar foreign policy positions, namely the Social Democrats, the Green Party, the Christian Democrats, the Free Democrats, and in Bavaria, the Christian Social Union.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting overview of the situation and the prognosis. So Ukraine has achieved a lot, but it remains in a precarious situation. You've mentioned a lot of variables and factors. You didn't say too much about the Ukrainian internal political situation. We have presidential elections coming next year, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the prospects of Poroshenko and of general political stability within Ukraine. Will Ukraine be able to maintain the momentum that it has shown over the last 4 or 5 years?
Yeah. Maybe I should have made that more explicit when I talked about the sandwich model of reforms. And just to remind you what is meant by that is that you have a strong civil society that is not particularly linked to any political groups, and that sort of exists independent from the rather corrupt political class that is still in power on the one side. And on the other side, you have the international donor organizations that have large leverage because Ukraine needs the foreign money currently, and they can apply conditionality mechanisms to the disbursement of their support, whether it comes from the Monetary Fund or the European Union. And these two forces, they cooperate very closely. And the situation that you then get, that it doesn't really matter that much anymore who is actually president, who is prime minister, and who is in parliament, because these two, as long as they are present and as long as they cooperate closely and as long as the international donors can apply the conditionality mechanisms, these are the main drivers of reforms. And whether it's going to be Poroshenko or Tymoshenko or somebody else is then sort of secondary. The other issue that I would mention here is that currently the president is still able to preserve this pyramid structure in Ukrainian politics, actually reminiscent in a way. I mean, Poroshenko is very different from Yanukovych, but the structure of politics is somewhat similar, that the parliament is under control of the president, or not full control, but largely, and the president is the hegemonic figure. The prime minister is a man of the president, and you have basically this informal patron-client relationships that are still present. They are not as as strong and as prevalent and as effective as under Yanukovych, but I think the basic structure is still there. Ukraine still has this paternalistic political system. It is not as strong as under Yanukovych, but it's still existing. My suspicion is, however, that after the next elections, this whole thing will break down, because after the presidential and parliamentary elections of 2014, Poroshenko was able to recreate this pyramid structure in spite of Ukraine getting again a semi-presidential constitution. So after the victory of the Euromaidan, that was part of the deal actually between Yanukovych and the protesters, and the Western foreign ministers signed this deal as well, Steinmeier, Fabius, and Sikorsky. That was the famous deal of, I think, of 21st of February 2014. Under this deal, the semi-presidential constitution has been reintroduced. And in spite of the constitution now being semi-presidential, and the president having actually reduced powers according to the constitution, the actual political system is still super-presidential. But my suspicion will be that after the next elections, this is going to break down, and that what we will see again is in fact conflict between the president and the prime minister. Hopefully not as conflictual as it was between Tymoshenko and Yushchenko after the Orange Revolution, but I don't see this structure being there again. And what could even happen is a parliamentarization of Ukrainian politics. That if you get a prime minister who is stronger than the president as a personality in terms of political resources, in terms of political skills, then perhaps the Verkhovna Rada and the government will become stronger than the president and his or her administration. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I don't have an answer. It's so volatile currently, this pre-electoral situation, that it's very difficult to predict. But my message is it's not that important, actually. Whether it's going to be Poroshenko or Tymoshenko or Vakarchuk, at the end of the day, the structure of Ukrainian politics and the way reforms are done has changed to such a degree and is so dissimilar from other countries where politicians make the decisions and politicians decide about reforms, that the question about who exactly will be on the top will be not so important. Except, of course, if somebody, I don't know, if Azov or if the opposition bloc or I don't know, the radical party of Oleh Lyashko or somebody like, if a sort of political outsider of this type comes to power, then that would perhaps change the situation. But if we take the sort of the national democratic spectrum, and currently I would predict that it will be somebody from the national democratic spectrum, the new president, and perhaps also, or I hope, the new prime minister, then it won't matter that much. That is my feeling, at least.
You have a question over here?
Can you tell us some more about the secret organizations or brotherhoods that remain active in the Ukraine even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and are they still active today?
Which brotherhoods?
You seem to suggest there's some sort of a shadow or informal government that is active under the Soviets, but also under the new Ukrainian government.
Well, I don't mean here any particular conspiracy or sort of secret organizations, but what I mean here, and I thought it's self-explanatory, it's the informal exchange mechanisms and these sort of patron-client relationships. You have basically these informal clans, groups of friends, of relatives, of people who know each other from university, who are tied to each other. Kumovstvo is also a term that can be applied to that. And that is something, and I can only recommend this brilliant book by Henry Hale, Patronal Politics. that is actually structuring these post-Soviet political processes in these post-Soviet societies. And these structures, but these are not, I wouldn't call them secret brotherhoods. They still exist. They are also in a complicated relationship with the official institutions. So the official institutions, especially the presidency, but also the parties, the parliament, the ministries, they do play a role. They are not trivial. But the actual political processes and decisions are rather made through these clan networks. And that is still there, unfortunately. And that is, of course, one could speculate whether Poroshenko would have become a president without the war. Yeah, because in a way, that's a huge contradiction. That the Euromaidan was an anti-oligarchic revolution, and then an oligarch is made president. Yeah, but at least that is what was my feeling in summer or in spring 2014, that Poroshenko got his political chance because people assumed that he is an experienced politician, he is an experienced economic manager, and in this crisis situation, Ukraine needs somebody with such experience. But the problem is, of course, that Poroshenko is flesh of the old system. He's one of the founders of the Party of Regions. He is part of this clan system. He is himself, or he was already before that, a patron, and now he is the major patron in this patronalistic system. So it does still exist, but the two competing systems here are the rule of law, the functioning of the official political institutions according to the constitution and according to law, and then these sort of semi-legal structures. And I think it has diminished. The rule of law has become more important. For instance, in procurement, in the public procurement system, this famous Soros system has reduced this influence of informal structures, but also in many other regards. But it's still there. Yeah.
Madam, and Oliver at the back.
Thank you very much for your presentation, especially several times you mentioned the importance of foreign direct investment. I agree with that. I think foreign direct investment is very important. Economic prosperity in a country helps to keep it together as much as I think language or tradition or culture or anything. If people feel prosperous, they want to protect what they have. My question is, in this basket of foreign direct investment, do you see Russian-sourced direct investment in there? Should Ukraine accept it? Should they attract it? Or is there too much risk involved there? Because there's lots of them.
Yeah. That's a difficult question, and I don't know. I don't want to make a statement on that because because it has become, the whole issue of trade with Russia and economic relations with Russia has become very politicized. And well, I would say something that perhaps everybody could agree to is that any foreign direct investment would be fine as long as it is then not used for political purposes. And the suspicion is, of course, always with Russian foreign direct investment that eventually this is going to have a political dimension. So that's the problem. And but I'm also not an economist enough. I think you've mixed some of my. You mixed me a little bit up with Anders Umland, actually, which often happens. Some of the parts of my biography that you mentioned actually are not Anders's. That happens quite often. My things that I have said are ascribed to Anders Umland, and things that he has said are ascribed to me because our names sound so similar. We are good friends, by the way, and we make lots of jokes about this. So I'm not competent enough to speak about that. For that, somebody like Umland would be an economist would be more competent to speak about.
Let me give you an easier answer to deal with. in terms of the other instruments you were talking about, the sandwich metaphor, do you see engagement opportunities for middle powers like Canada? To paraphrase that, is there any Canadian bacon in the Ukrainian sandwich?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think there's a whole array of ways that Canada could help. I mean, there are all these traditional, I had this long list of traditional developmental aid, cultural exchange, economic support, you know, in all sorts of spheres. I think that is something that is well known. But what could be, for instance, important is Canada's influence within NATO. So one of the major issues, for instance, for Ukraine is going to be how to get into some sort of international security structure. In a way, that's the most basic issue. In a way, you could even say that if you wouldn't know anything about the history of Russia and the Soviet Union and the Russian-Ukrainian relationship, if you would only look at the map, at the political map of Europe, you would know that there is a problem. Because you have these countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, that are not in a security structure. And NATO and Canada thereby becomes then a factor here, because the security structure could perhaps be an East European security structure that would involve non-NATO member countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, but also member countries of NATO. And maybe this Bucharest 9 group, which includes 9 East European member countries of NATO, could become then sort of the basis for such a structure. But for that, NATO would have to agree to such an extension of security assurances by NATO member countries beyond the borders of NATO. That is a very tricky and complicated issue. And that is something I've talked to Polish politicians and analysts about. That is now, there's now a lot of tension between Ukraine and Poland, but I think one should not underestimate that in spite of all the tensions and all the humanitarian and historical issues, there's still a lot of interest in Poland for Ukraine, a lot of sympathy, and also a lot of well-informed national interest of Poland in the stability and security of Ukraine. However, Poland is afraid to engage itself more intensely with Ukraine, and I've talked about that to several people, because the Polish politicians and experts, they fear that if they start engaging with Ukraine in the military field, that will then weaken the security guarantees that Poland has within NATO. So that there is a sort of a red line that Poland or Romania or other countries may cross, and then their own security would be limited. And here, a country like Canada could come in and could start discussing, for instance, with the US, whether if the US is not able to provide the major non-NATO ally status to Ukraine, whether the US could make some assurances towards Warsaw, towards Romania, and say, guys, if you want to be active beyond the borders of NATO, we are going to cover your back. So if you give security assurances to Ukraine, if you engage militarily with Ukraine, out of sympathy or your own national interest or whatever reasons, the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty will still be there fully for you. So that would be something where I could see a country like Canada playing a role as sort of, because that is not something that people talk or think about in Washington. There's this hesitancy in Europe, but also in America. We don't want to extend NATO, because then we would get into a conflict with Russia, and after all, Ukraine is not so important to us. But for countries like Poland and Romania and Slovakia, direct neighbors of Ukraine, they might be persuaded, or they might by themselves come to the conclusion that it would be in their own national interest to support Ukraine, but then they would have to be reassured by NATO that their own security will be not diminished by that. There's, by the way, a model already for that. Turkey has, in 2010, signed an agreement with Azerbaijan, a non-NATO country, and Turkey is still a NATO member country, and given security assurances to Azerbaijan, an Eastern Partnership country, also like Ukraine. And sort of Turkey has already crossed that line. And Turkey is also a non-nuclear member of NATO. Unlike the US has, of course, crossed that line many times with this major NATO ally schemes. I mean, by the text of the treaty, of the Washington Treaty, the US has all 28 other members of NATO drawn into security assurances it has given to South Korea, to Egypt, to Israel, and so on. But the US is a nuclear power, so this is maybe not. But Turkey is not a nuclear power and has also given. So this is something that I think could maybe someday become important. But for that, of course, the humanitarian issues, for instance, between Poland and Ukraine would have to be resolved. I don't think the Poles are going to make such a major step before there is not some basic friendship reestablished again.
Within the last week, an article in Ukrainian of yours appeared in Discourse, in which you discussed a post-Putin period and democratization of Russia. Now, we've seen under Putin, we've seen how Russia has a plan to weaken the West, to weaken liberal democracy throughout the world, and they consistently work to implement that plan. The West does not seem to have that plan. Just as you wrote in this article, they didn't have any kind of plan for Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they still don't really have a long-term plan to secure democratization of Russia, which really is needed. Mm-hmm. They don't have a plan to, they do not even want to talk about the taboo subject of regime change, which is really what is needed in Russia. They don't have a plan to separate or to drive a wedge between the parasitic elite of Russia and the common people of Russia, whereas Russia has all these plans to weaken the West, and we've seen what a job they've done in America. So can any of this discussion that you've discussed and made tonight about Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia drifting more towards Europe, can any of that be achieved unless you have regime change in Russia?
Well, basically, I mean, the approach I've taken in this presentation is that Russia will remain as it currently is or become even worse. So this is that's, in terms of security, you always have to proceed from the bad case scenario. You cannot, and here I speak about a good case scenario, which is very counterintuitive. And maybe for those of you who have not read this, I'm not talking there about some sort of magical democratization of Russia, but what I see is it will eventually happen. I just don't know why, how, and when exactly. Is that the current Russian regime, the so-called Putin system, is not sustainable. It's a petrostate. It doesn't have an economic developmental problem, and at some point, I think the clans will start fighting each other. The clans that I've talked about earlier, because especially when Putin becomes unable to balance the different clans, and they would have to find a successor, then I think the system becomes unstable. And that we should now already think about it, and we should not miss then the moment when it comes, as we did in 1991, I think. And the problem was in 1991 that nobody had really, or very few people had ever really thought about what to do actually if the Soviet system disappears. Yeah? And then when it disappeared, then people were very happy, but they didn't have a sort of a scheme for that. And so I don't want to here read perhaps the article. It has appeared in English in the Open Democracy on website, and in Ukrainian in Zerkalo Tizhnya, as well as in the Russian version of Zerkalo Tizhnya and Zerkalo Nedeli. So, but the argument is here not so much that there would be a democratic movement and a color revolution or something like that, but that the system would self-destruct itself, because it is unsustainable. Yes, and if that happens then, and if the West is then prepared, and if the West can then sort of push Russia towards a democratic, non-imperialistic development, then of course many of the issues that I've discussed here would simply disappear. Then, if Russia becomes a saturated democratic nation state that is happy with its current borders, then of course then in a way you don't need NATO membership anymore. I mean, if that is then a stable situation for countries like Ukraine. Yeah, but I think that's the core of the problem, and one would have to think. But it is a difficult and different issue. Here I've only talked about this sort of proceeding from the sort of default situation that Russia will remain imperialistic, and perhaps even under a new ruler.
I'd like to ask you about Russian public opinion. This is somewhat related to the previous question. Even if by some miracle Russia were to obtain a liberal democratic government and the Russian-speaking Krista Freeland were to join it as a minister, the very notion of Ukrainian sovereignty would still face tremendous opposition in Russia, because the Russian historical narrative begins with the case of the Rus, and most Russians regard Ukrainian and Belarusian as dialects of their own language. Do you see any prospect of any evolution of Russian opinion toward a different stance?
I mean, what I would hope for is if the system breaks down, then, and if the clans start fighting each other, and I'm much more here concerned with this sort of the agreement within the system and less about Navalny or Yavlinsky or something like that. My hope would then be what happens is that mass media becomes demonopolized, that the different clans would perhaps obtain control over certain mass media, and then you would still perhaps not have an ideal mass media situation, but you would have, in a way, a little bit like in Ukraine, different oligarchs controlling different mass media, and you would then have some sort of pluralism. And then I could imagine that there would then be a channel for truthful information about what happened in the Donbass, what happened in Crimea, and then I could imagine a process of recognition of Russian guilt and responsibility for what happened in the Donbass, and perhaps even at the end of such a process, then an apology from Russia for what it has done to Ukraine. Yes, and I mean there would have to be a large public discourse about Russian national identity and so on, and a reassessment of what it means to be Russian, so to say. But the example I mention, if this is not in the English version, but in the Ukrainian and in the Russian version, is that has happened already to the Germans after World War II. So we were once the most imperialistic nation of the world and ultra-nationalist and so on. But still, this with Western support, we redefined our national identity rather fundamentally. And I think that will someday also happen to the Russians. I don't know when and how exactly, but eventually it will.
We have time for one final question. Svetlana?
Dr. Umland, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You mentioned the reanimation package of reform organizations, umbrella organization that encompasses several groups that work in culture and health and in other spheres. I wonder if you could please elaborate more on their work and assess their work, for example, from your perspective. What would you consider their major successes? That's why they've been in existence, I think, for 4 years, if I'm not mistaken. They self-organized around the middle of 2014, right? So what would be their major successes, in your opinion, and have they suffered any losses?
Well, many of the new laws and institutions that have emerged since can be ascribed maybe not only to this particular umbrella organization, but largely to them. I mentioned already the ProZorro public procurement system, the new anti-corruption bureau, the law on electronic declaration of income and property by state officials. And a whole number of other issues. As I said, I'm more of a sort of political scientist looking on international issues rather than on public administration issues. So there would be other experts who would know more about the details of the various reforms. Yeah, this is a quite peculiar. There's actually a book forthcoming, an electronic book with Ponars, which is a program of George Washington University. I can't remember all the names. There are 3 authors. One is Graham Robertson, and 2 other authors who describe the sandwich model. And the main reference point is Reassessment Paket Reform and their cooperation with the international donor organizations. Yeah, and they argue that this is a new model of reform actually, because the traditional focus has been on politicians, and sometimes in some theories about successful reforms, the focus are governmental politicians that. For instance, finance ministers that cooperate with international financial organizations to push through reforms, or opposition politicians that are sort of driving reforms. But what we have in Ukraine is a political class where both the opposition and the governmental coalition is still within this clan network and still infiltrated with all these oligarchic interests. But paradoxically, reform has still happened, and quite a lot of reform has happened. And the explanation is that actually the politicians were pressured by this sandwich model, the sandwich mechanisms, and that is a new model of reform that they allege is quite novel and peculiar to Ukraine, and is unlike in other countries that have executed successfully reforms.
All this talk of sandwiches is making me hungry. I'd like to ask a representative of the Ukrainian-Canadian Professional Business Association of Edmonton to come forward and to thank our speaker. And then I'll have a couple of announcements.
I'd like to...
Microphone.
He's not on the microphone. There's no microphone. Just talk loud, Alan.
Okay, I'll just talk loud.
Alan Nazarevich.
I'd like to thank Dr. Andreas Umland for continuing the fine tradition that QS and the Ukrainian Professional Business Association have in having the Shevchenko lecture every year. I guess one comment I have is from my own personal point of view. I try to do a lot of reading on Ukrainian topics and the current events in Ukraine, but it's quite different when you get somebody who does all this reading, all this thinking, all this discussing, and then you are on the spot there in Kyiv, where a lot of this activity is going on. and then gathering all the information, trying to synthesize it, put it together, and try to give us a big picture as to what is going on. And this is very valuable. It's the kind of thing you never really get from a newspaper. The other comment I was going to make is that you commented that your name is similar to that of Anders Umland, and that there may be some confusion. I just wanted you to know that this is deliberate on our part. Last year we had Dr. Bogdan Kravchenko speak at a time when the director was named Dr. Volodymyr Kravchenko. So we just wanted to maintain that tradition by tonight. Yes. Okay. And on behalf of the Ukrainian Professional Business Association, I'd like to make you a gift of this honorarium. Thank you very much for speaking to us tonight.